Hey, Linda Winter again. So I want to do an overview of the zip bind system. Some of you have seen my videos where I've got detailed instructions. So I want to give you an overview. That way, if you are working with the zip bind system and the stitch in the ditch foot, you can come see kind of a, here's the way it goes, this is a process. And then you can go watch those detailed videos for the particulars. So the system is for hand binding and stitching in the ditch, but many of you like me want to cheat, stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch should look nice. The front should be in the ditch, not in the ditch, whoops, on the binding in the ditch, and then on the quilt itself. That's called stitching along the ditch. So the goal is to stitch in the ditch. You can see where I've got all my wrinkles because I pulled this back 1,327,000 times. There's the stitch in the ditch. That's where stitch in the ditch should be. So rule number 1, stitch in the ditch. Rule number 2, catch the binding on the back. Now, this is in combination with rule number 3. Catch the binding on the back, make it pretty. The stitching should be the same. The width should be the same. This little lip right here, that should be the same. The problem is we've all done stitching in the ditch where we've caught and missed on the back, and what we've gotten is it's a little bit wider, it's a little bit inconsistent. That's called the it's just ugly, rip it out and do it by hand method. We don't want to do that. Your mitered corners should also be the same, what we call flat and full, sharp and crisp. If I line these up on a mat, I shouldn't see a rounded corner on the front side. All your mitered corners should be exactly the same. Same thing on the back side. And view 1, view 2, view 3. I'll talk about view 3 in a little bit. So we want nice, pretty bindings, whether we sew by hand or stitch in the ditch. The tools are great for hand binding. If you say, well, I don't stitch in the ditch, I sew by hand, well, good for you. This makes hand binding faster, better. It takes half the time, and what you get is more accurate, more consistent. So I want to walk through the process. I want you to start on a practice piece. I know you want to do your own thing, but I'm going to be the kindergarten teacher and say, hey, we're going to draw a yellow flower and we're going to do leaves like this or petals like this, not like this today. The next time you go to do this, you can do whatever you want to do, but your first time around, it's really important that you follow the directions. That way you'll be able to say, oh, I get it. I get why this tool was designed the way it was. If you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always got. And if you always are getting what you got, then you don't need to watch this video. So your first time around, I'm going to tell you a few other things. What you know about bindings, what you know about sewing your bindings on, I want you to throw out the window. For instance, 1/4 inch. I don't want a 1/4 inch seam allowance when we first get started. Same thing with the width of your binding. Instead of 2 1/4, 2 1/2, you can do that later, but what I want you to start out with is 3 inches of binding. Right now, when you look at this binding, you can see I've got 1 1/2 inches. The reason why I like 3 inches is a couple. 1, you don't use 3 inches probably on a regular basis. 2, your fingers, when we go to do a move here, if you have 2 1/4, 2 1/2, your fingers won't know the move that we're going to do here. This is called muscle memory. When we use the zip bind tool, you'll get to see this in a little bit. That motion that I just did, when you've got 2 1/4, 2 1/2 to learn on, the motion isn't nearly as big as what I have with 3 inches. When you learn this motion for 3 inches, then your fingers will know, muscle memory, what to do with 2 1/4 and 2 1/2. So I've got some reasons why I want you to do 3 inches to start with. So we're going to do 3 inches. You'll notice I've sewn the binding together first. I have a video that'll show you how to use the no slip strip ruler. You can also use the 1/2 inch ruler to cut your bindings. That way they're perfect straight. As we sew, we're going to use a stitch in the ditch foot, and I have lots of videos that'll show you how this foot attaches to your particular machine. And I'm going to be filming a new video too on this. So when we sew, this is going to keep us sewing straight because there's a ledge. This ledge right here, it's called the fence. This fence, as we go to sew, adjusted with our seam allowance, is going to sew straight. When I sew the next side and the next side and the next side, that means I'm going to sew straight consistently. So that way when we're stitching on the front, when we get to the back, I'm going to have the same amount, the same amount, the same amount, the same amount. If you don't sew straight, how can you catch the binding on the back? Straight, consistent. So our seam allowance we're going to use with our 3 inches of binding is a scant 3/8 seam allowance. That means a little bit less, and let me make this just so you can see it a little more. Can you see that scant 3/8? It might be that much, and it might be this little, depending on your sewing machine. At this point in time, I'd rather you go for what I had a minute ago, a little bit wider, just to be sure. That's based on the loft of your batting, the type of fabric you're going to be using. We're talking about cotton fabric on the top, cotton fabric on the back, and a low loft batting. A scant 3/8 seam allowance when we sew is going to give me a little more a little less. So I'll have a little more binding for me to catch. All right, so we're going to sew. On the videos that you'll see in all the details, I'll start over here, sew. Stop at the corner, and then I'll sew. Where we start and where we stop is based on this project. I'm using a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance here. That means I'm going to use a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance over here and a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance over here. So that means I stop at a scant 3/8 from the edge. One of my long detailed videos, I'll show you how to guess or how to judge where that scant 3/8 inch seam allowance is. But that's where we want to stop because that's going to give us our seam allowance for the next side. We're going to use minute miters. You get 3 minute miters in your package, a large, a medium, and a small. On the video, I talk about eyeball. This fits. I don't even have to eyeball it. I know this one's too small. If I had my binding narrower, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, do you see how that fits better there than this one does? So my eyeball lets me know this is the one to use. We're going to grab our fabric, scoot to the edge, grab this binding fabric over. Fabric triangle coming together. Do you see how that diagonal is going to give me the beginning of a perfect, accurate, beautiful, consistent mitered corner? When I look right inside of here, this isn't this, and it's not that. That comes right there from where I stopped at the edge. So if you don't get that nice sharp corner inside here, then that means you've stopped sewing at the wrong spot. Let me just show you again. Do you see right inside of there? It's not this. Let me see if I can pull that, and it's not this. See how that doesn't line up? It should be right around there. So that happens. That's what we want to get. Now, typically, we use straight pins or quilting clips. They have those Wonder Clips, too. In the system, you get the zip guns. Zip guns come in a large, medium, and a small. We'll look at all the package later on. And they have 8 clips already in them. I'm just holding that there just for a minute so I can remove this. And when I go to remove this, what I want to do is go 1, 2, 3. I call it a 3-sided square. When I squeeze this, you can see here how that opens that up. That releases this fabric that I just caught. I'm going to squeeze here, hit the clip, 1, 2, 3. Now I'm left-handed, so I'm going to go this way. Right-handers, instead of going in towards your body, you're going to go out towards your body. You're basically going to be going this way, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and I think on the video I show you some of that too. All right, so I'm not ready to sew. This corner needs to look like this corner. You're used to, if you've done bindings, you're used to seeing this. So that's what we want to do here. So we're going to pop, grab, turn. Pop means get that standing tall. I've got that standing tall. I'm going to grab. When I grab, I want to rub these 2 pieces of fabric, this piece with this piece together, so they're lined up. When I line them up, I turn this to where we've already sewn, and we're going to sew this side down. Now, way back in the old days, I'd say put a clip here. Now I say, oh, forget it. Go to your sewing machine. So we're going to go to the sewing machine. The foot that we've already adjusted for our scant 3/8 inch seam allowance here and here is exactly the same. So what do? We're going to sew the side down. We stopped at a scant 3/8 from the edge, but now we want to start right at the edge. Why? Dogs and babies. Dogs and babies have fingernails and claws. If I stopped, dropped down at a scant 3/8 inch seam allowance, this right here and this right here might be weak when I put that binding on the first time. And if dogs and babies have fingernails and claws and they get in there and they get in there, even if I've sewn that down, they might get in here and I don't have as much stability. So I want to start right at that edge. So as I start, I'm going to stitch. And as I stitch, the feed dogs are going to progress this fabric forward. Right about now, I want to remove the clip. Don't pull this way. That clip is on there pretty good. Even though you can see I didn't really grab all of that, it's still on there pretty tight. This is on there tight. I'm trying to pull that. So instead, we want to loosen it. We're going to pull it down towards your body. So I pull that off. You can keep it in your hand if you want, or you can throw it in a bowl. You'll see on my video, I've got some of my wood turning bowls that my dad made for me. And as I stitch, the feed dogs are going to progress that fabric forward. My job as I'm stitching is not to watch the needle, but to watch right here. My fabric goes right along the edge. And you'll see I've got a bunch of videos that'll show you about the foot, stitching in the ditch, but I've got 2 videos that'll teach you more about the foot as well. My job is to keep this fabric with this fabric next to that edge. And as we continue to stitch, the fabric progresses forward. We would stop at that scant 3/8 inch from the edge, miter the corner with the minute miter, sew the next side, continue on, miter the corner, sew, and then join your bindings. I'll show you a bunch of different ways to join your bindings on my videos. When you're all finished with this corner that you see here would be the same everywhere. And when we fold this over, that's going to give us a beautiful mitered corner. So what we want to see, I'm just kind of fingering that a little bit. See that nice sharp crisp there? So what we would do here is we would finger this a little bit. You can take your iron if you want to, but instead I just do this. Imagine that I've got this all the way around and I just give this a good finger press. This tool, the Sew-Mate, does a beautiful job of fingering that as well. There's a nice flat edge here, so you can pull that out. You see how that just really gives it a crisp edge? What that's going to do is open that seam up for me, so when I'm ready to go to stitch in the ditch, I've got a better front surface. All right, so we're going to pretend that I've got binding all along here. We're going to grab with our zip gun. If we're hand binding, we do our mitered corner first. What I'm doing is just fingering this a little bit. I just want to get this nice and flat, and I'm going to grab my small minute miter. Even if you're not planning to hand bind, I want to show you how to do the mitered corner with the minute miter now, and then we'll do the stitching in the ditch. This guy here fits better than this one does. Pretty easy to eyeball that. But later on, after you've learned how to use the tools and you decide to do a different width than I have, imagine I have this much fabric on the front as well as on the back. And do you see how that's a better fit than this? So you've got for hand binding up to 1 inch, stitch in the ditch up to a scant inch. For stitching in the ditch, when we do our binding, we've got down to a true 1/4 inch, and then a 1/4 inch for your hand binding as well. But this width right here is what I have here. That one fits. But can you see here, this one, it fits better than this one. So we're talking eyeball. So this is the width of my binding that I want, so I'm going to use this minute miter. So we're going to grab. I'm going to grab, and then I want to scoot this. Here's the edge of my fabric. What I want to do, for me being left-handed, is my thumb. My thumb here. Now, if you're pulling and that's tight, it doesn't slide easily, get a dryer sheet. Everybody hopefully has dryer sheets. Place it inside of here and then just rub that back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes these are a little sticky inside of here. It's not just that they're tight. This is a good little workout, but this sometimes is rough. So a dryer sheet will work for you with that. So we're going to grab our fabric, scoot to the edge. So I said, me being left-handed, my thumb. You right-handers, it's going to be your pointer finger. So you put your pointer finger here. What that lets me do, and I can't do this very well right-handed, but what that lets me do is it tells this tool where to stop. If I don't have a finger there, I got to do it the other way, sorry. Do you see how that goes right off? So I want to put my finger there. So for me, left-handed, you all left-handers, we're going to be using the thumb. Right-handers, it's going to be the pointer finger. So I'm going to scoot. Now what we want to do is have the triangle of the fabric catching the triangle of the minute miter. If you have threads, cut your threads so they aren't showing. We're going to fold this fabric over towards the minute miter, and I hold here, and when I pull this, the minute miter, that way, this fabric's going to catch in that triangle. So we'll hold that, and then there's that mitered corner. So I get a beautiful mitered corner. If you were going to hand bind, we take our needle and thread where my fingernail is, take a locking stitch, hide the knot underneath the binding, take another locking stitch, and then we can remove the minute miter. Whether we're hand binding or stitching in the ditch, we're going to remove the same way. Squeeze. I hope you can see that opens that up a little bit. We're going to do the 3-sided square again. 1, 2, 3. Again, if this is sticky, when we do that 1, 2, 3, then it's going to grab. What that's going to end up with is giving us a mitered corner like this. So we have view 1, view 2, and my view 3. Now view 3, I'm going to flop my fabric around in the opposite direction so you can see my view 3. I call this no snouts allowed. Some of you that have seen me, taken classes from me, you hear me say no snouts allowed. Way back in the day when I didn't know what I was doing, I had projects that had that in there. See the nostril and the nostril? That is not what you want to have on your quilt. That belongs on a dog, your cat, or your face. Snouts on your faces, not on your quilts. So we don't want that. When I pull over my project, I'm going to show you our mitered corners. Do you see from here in one direction and then in the opposite direction? What that lets that fabric do is lay down nice and flat. That feels good. It's not mushy, gushy, lumpy, bumpy, as Eleanor Burns has said. So we get a beautiful mitered corner. So if you're hand binding, we would do that first. We're going to use the zip bind tool next. The zip bind tool is adjustable. I mentioned wider bindings. If you have a wider binding, you would adjust both screws, and I've got videos that are going to show you in detail for a wider binding. This, from this little lip, I call it the groove, from the groove to this is the width of your fabric. There aren't any measurements on here for a reason. The reason why is if we put measurements on here, I would tell you, you must use this kind of cotton fabric on the front, this kind of cotton fabric on the back, and you must use use a particular kind of batting. Well, I don't want to. If I do an apron, I don't want a batting. If I do a high loft batting, it might be polyester and it might be a lot more lofty than this. So instead, there aren't measurements. That's why I'm going to teach you how to use this tool. You and your belly are going to adjust this tool. Do you see when I make this narrower? This from here to here, the distance from where that groove is, the fabric of your binding would be inside of there, and here, that's the width of my binding. So if I had a narrower binding like that, that would be probably appropriate for that. So our job is to figure out how wide our binding is. Remember when I said kindergarten teacher, draw on a yellow flower, the petals are going to be like this, not like, the petals are going to be like this, not like this? Well, I mentioned 3 inches of binding. Scant 3/8 seam allowance on the stitch and the ditch foot. Large minute miter on the front, small minute miter on the back. So I want to tell you on this. 3/4, 5/8. What? There aren't any written directions, any written numbers on here. So 3/4, 5/8, where is it? This is 0, this is 1. See how there's a slide there? So 0 to 1. So this is about, in that slide position, halfway. So if this is 0 and that's half, then 3/4 is going to be closer to this. So when I look at this, can you see how that's about 3/4? So from here, let's go this way. 0, 1, that's about 3/4. So I'm going to tighten that up. Now, which side did I tighten? The slanted side. The slanted side I'm going to tighten first. The other side, when you first get it, it's like this. So you'll unscrew both sides, and now what we want to do, and Dylan, we're going to come to my belly. We're going to place this in my belly. I have the slanted side that I've tightened here, and I'm looking at that down here, and I've got about 3/4. That's where I want it to go. And then I turn this over. We're going to do thumb, thumb, pointer finger, and I push this out. I want to feel that these are even. So I'm feeling with my pointer fingers, and I'm going to go tighten that up. And then I turn, and I see if I've got this straight. Because from here to here, these should be the same. Let me just mess this up. Can you see how this here, there's a different angle than it is here? So this needs to be straight. So when I look down at this, I should be able to see that and feel that. And I turn it over and I look to see from the edge. I'm making this side, the slanted side, with the flat side, I'm making them even. So when I make them even, I feel that there, and I'm going to test the tool. So the slanted side is up. This is the back of my project. We're going to place this with my fabric inside, so I'm squeezing this open, and we're going to pull back and pull forward. Pull back and pull forward. Now here's the deal. I have 3 rules or 3 clues on the video. Clue 1, the binding should sit tightly in the groove, but not so tight there's a pucker. There's the groove. But the real trick for clue 1 is I shouldn't fight with the fabric. So I'm going to do that again, and I want you to see if I fight. Pointer finger, thumb, thumb. I'm going to pull back and pull forward. If I fight when I'm doing this, then I've made this too small. So we're going to pull back and pull forward. I didn't fight, so it's not too tight. It's either just right or it's too big. So we're going to look to see, is the binding sitting nicely, tightly in that groove? I've got a video specifically on this. I show you too big, too small, and just right. Goldilocks. It's too hot. It's too cold. It's too big. It's too small. It's just right. I look at this and I see that's just right. That looks good. Now we're going to go on to clue 2, check it out, and see if we've adjusted the tool correctly. Clue 2, the lock line should not show. Now you don't see the lock line because I've adjusted the tool correctly. So let me show you the lock line. There's the lock line. That lock line shouldn't sit on top of my binding, and it shouldn't sit on my quilt. So I'm sliding this back and forth and feeling, and notice where my fingers are. They're here, not here. The handles are for you to grab to put the fabric inside, but then we grab here, or we can grab here. But when I slide this back and forth, you can see you don't see the lock line. If I made this too big, the lock line would be showing on the quilt. All right, that would be our clue that lets us know. Now, clue 3, I say, is for men, because they don't always pay attention to clue 1 and clue 2. And it's not an intelligence thing. It's just, hey, get her done kind of thing. But if I made this too big, I could put my hand down and pull this. And that would get the lock line not showing, and that would get the binding in the groove, but it would also create a gap up here. I don't want to have a gap in between the fabric and this metal part of my zip bind tool. So my tool is adjusted correctly for hand binding. So Dylan, you're going to come up to me, and I'm going to pretend that I've got a big, beautiful quilt, and I'm sitting down. I've got a couple different ways for me to sew. We've already done our mitered corner, so we've got a beautiful mitered corner and we've got our needle and thread dangling. I'm going to stitch, stitch, scoot, stitch, stitch, scoot, stitch, stitch, scoot, stitch, stitch, scoot. Now right about now, I'm sewing right-handed, by the way, if you haven't figured that out. Right about now, I need to scoot the whole project. You notice where my fabric is? Again, I'm pretending that I'm sitting down. I've got this in alignment, the arm and my fabric are in alignment. And then I scoot this forward and I stitch and stitch and stitch and stitch and stitch and stitch. This tool is going to keep my binding the same, everywhere the same. No more pins, no more quilting clips, no more straight clips. Steam a seam, stitch witchery, peel off tape, permanent glue, washable glue, or throw in caution to the wind. I've tried all those methods and this is the method that I prefer. Stitch, 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 stitch. So Dylan, zoom out a little bit and I want to show you a couple things that we don't want to do. When we look at this, do you see my hand here? I'm pretty good here. This is an alignment to here. So if you like to stitch here or you like to stitch here, you're good to go. But if you like to stitch this way, do you see my lap? Imagine I'm sitting down. This is in my lap and my arm is here. I'm not in alignment. My fabric, my quilt is not in alignment with my arm. If I pull this, I'm going to pull this right off. And Dylan, now you can see right there. See how that fabric isn't consistent. So for this tool to work, whichever way you like to sew, you're sewing here, you're sewing here, you're sewing away from you, like this. The idea is your arm and your fabric have to be in alignment. If I have this here, my arm needs to be pulling this way. So I can stitch like this if you're on a table in front of you. What I don't want to do, notice here, see how this works? Okay, so what I don't want to do is have this where I'm going kind of, I can't even do it wrong here, but where you're kind of going crazy with this. The easiest way to get it wrong is when you're sewing like this. You can see my fabric is down here and my arm is here. So think about doing this. Plus my arm holds the bulk, the weight of that quilt as I'm stitching. Your eyes determine where you are here or here. So I've got a video that shows you a couple different ways. I say sewing right to left in front of you, sewing away from you right to left. So there's a bunch of different ways. But I want to focus on stitching in the ditch. So I'm going to move over to this side and hopefully Dylan can work with me. We didn't talk about doing this beforehand because I want to show you stitching in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch, my tool has been adjusted so far correctly, but I have one more thing to do. What I want to do for stitching in the ditch is catch the binding on the back. This amount of fabric, I call that a hair, a smidge, a scant, a skosh, a wee bit. It's a little bit more. I'm being a little sarcastic when I say all of that. But what I don't want is a whole lot. Can you see how that's too much fabric there compared to here? I want just a little bit. We're getting that because of the stitch in the ditch foot. The 3 inches and the scant 3/8 inch seam allowance gives me a little more on the back than I have on the front. So I need to adjust this tool accordingly. Back to the belly, the slanted side, we're going to adjust a hair, a smidge, a scant, a skosh, a wee bit. I'm feeling and then I double check. I'm looking at it here and I'm adjusting my left side and my right side for a little bit more. And then hopefully you can see on that screen, this side's a little longer than that by a hair, a smidge. Okay, that's a little bit more. What that's going to do for me is when I place my fabric inside, remember thumb or pointer, finger, thumb, pull back, pull forward. It's now wider on the back than it is on the front by a hair, a smidge, a scant, a skosh, a wee bit. So I've got a video that shows you on your sewing machine to take off your free arm. Take off your free arm because when I go to stitch, I want the foot and the zip bind tool to be close together. If I've got the foot here and my stitch and my zip bind tool is here, I can't control what's going to happen here. So what we want to do is stitch in the ditch, as I mentioned before, stitch in the ditch. Not in the ditch on the binding, in the ditch on the quilt. That's called stitching along the ditch. You all have done that before. The problem is when you do that on the front, on the back, you catch and you miss. And if you've pinned or clipped, I'm going to pretend there's a pin here and a pin here. In between, when you're sewing on the other side, in between the pins, especially when you get to the second pin, your fabric starts to create a pucker. You all have seen puckers like that, and you just miss the fabric before that pin, and then afterwards your stitching is here. The needle would have gone from the other side here, and then this fabric is fatter, and then it flops over later on when this gets worn, used and abused. So what we want to do is catch the binding consistently. That's what the zip bind tool is going to do. When I slide this along, you can see this fabric, even though I just kind of put that wave in there, watch that fabric. The tool couldn't do a wave or ripple if I tried because of the zip bind tool. if I keep the stitch in the ditch foot and the zip bind tool close together. So we want to stitch in the ditch on the front. That's what this tool is going to do. This is going to take care of the backside, catch and miss, puckers and gaps. We want to stitch in the ditch. Instead of using a walking foot or a 1/4 inch piecing foot or a stitch in the ditch foot or a zipper foot, this foot where my needle goes, there's a physical ledge. That ledge there is going to go against the edge of my binding. You can see I'm trying to get this to go. It's not doing this because it has that ledge. What's going in that ledge, in that hole? The needle. When I tighten this up, it's going to create for me a physical channel. You might be able to see this part of the foot slants a little bit. It doesn't go straight. This part slants. That slants, I'm going to put it here. Hopefully we can see that's going to go underneath the fabric a little bit. Now I do have to point out the number 1. I should have a number 2 on. Couldn't find a number 2. 1 is no loft. I've got some batting in here. So 1 is for no batting, or a very thin piece of batting. Number 2, low loft, like I have here. Number 3, medium loft. Number 4, high loft. So if you've got that much, you're going to put on fence number 4. And I talk about that in the other videos. But that number 2, when I slide this along, you'll see this part is higher, and that slanted part will go underneath that binding a little bit. This is going to help me stitch in the ditch. Now what we want to do is do our mitered corner. So we're going to use that minute miter. You all saw me do the mitered corner before. So we're going to grab that minute miter. I'm going to go to my sewing machine as well. Imagine I've got my sewing machine. I've got the number 2 on and this foot is attached. I've got the foot open. I've taken off the free arm or the table, and you'll watch my video to see why that's important, but make sure you do that. I've scooted here, fold the fabric over, so that fabric and the triangle come together. I'm pinching this forward just a little bit to make sure that I'm going to catch. And we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, pinch, turn, pinch again. I'm on the front of my project. So I'm going to lower my needle first. So imagine I'm at the sewing machine. You'll see my little cheater method of getting the needle directly in the corner. The needle goes down into the corner, lower the presser foot. I don't tighten this up yet. This is being held by the sewing machine. And I'm going to scoot the zip bind close to the edge of my sewing machine. Why? I want the distance between the stitch in the ditch foot and my zip bind tool to be minimal. Stitch in the ditch, catch the binding on the back. So we're going to tighten this up. When I tighten this up, that's going to create on the back side that channel for me. As I stitch, my feed dogs are going to progress all of this forward. If you've got a machine that's a fancy machine that has an auto sensor, it's real important that you go turn that off. I talk about that on my Viking video because Viking has, I think it's one of the first machines that came out with auto sensor. Turn that off. Otherwise, this won't progress forward. So imagine this is progressing forward. My right hand has an important thing to do. Hold against the sewing machine here. My pointer finger is underneath, so it's like this. So I'm holding like this, not at the handles. Those handles here, put this on, take it off. Right now I don't want to do either. So I've got this here. So my needle would be right there. We'd catch the corner when we put that needle down, and as we stitch, this progresses forward. So pretend that I've got this at the sewing machine. This hand holds here. As this progresses forward, what we're looking at is this width, this width. Do you see this width? This width is the same on the front side because I've adjusted this tool and we've sewn it on with this foot. On the back side, it's really cool because this is a little wider, that's a little wider, that's a little wider, that's a little wider. I'm going to pull this up on the table so you can see. My hand stays here. Watch this width. It's the same, it's the same, it's the same. And what is it on the back? It's wider, wider, wider. So we're going to stitch in the ditch with the foot, this distance about from here to here, and we're going to catch the binding on the back every single time. Rule number 1, stitch in the ditch. Rule number 2, catch the binding on the back. Rule number 3, make it pretty. Pretty, the stitching is straight. This width is the same, is the same. This width is the same, is the same, is the same, is the same. And the bonus, it feels good. And the bonus, it's fast. It takes 1/4 of the time. Hand binding, stitching in the ditch. There's a learning curve on these tools, I promise you. You're going to spend the time learning this. I'll walk you through with my written directions in my videos. You have a question, pick up the phone and call me. Send me an email. If you don't get something, don't bang your head against the wall. Pick up the phone and call me. I'll walk you through. The tools are amazing when you know what you're doing. Learning curve, worth it. Absolutely. Thanks for watching. Hope this helps.